Sarah had always been an avid sleeper. From childhood, she'd been known for her ability to sleep through anything. The loudest thunderstorms, the howling wind, even the clatter of dishes in the kitchen. She was one of those rare people who would drift into sleep as soon as her head hit the pillow, her body sinking into a cocoon of comfort and peace. But something had changed recently. The peaceful slumber she once enjoyed had become a battleground, and the nightmares, they felt too real, started a few weeks ago on a restless Tuesday night. Sarah had awoken from one of her usual dreams, a dream of being chased through a dark forest by something she couldn't see. But this time, when she opened her eyes, her heart pounding, she wasn't in the comfort of her bed anymore. She was still in the forest. The trees loomed around her like giants, their skeletal branches reaching down to ensnare her. The air was thick with a musty, damp smell, and the ground beneath her feet felt alive, shifting and moving like it was breathing. She felt the presence of something behind her, breathing down her neck, but when she turned, nothing was there. She could hear faint whispers carried on the wind, whispers that made her skin crawl. In that instant, Sarah had bolted upright, sweat dripping down her face. She had rushed to turn on the lights, her chest heaving with panic. The room was exactly as it should be. Her apartment, dimly lit by the faint glow of the streetlights outside. But the sense of dread still clung to her, like an invisible weight pressing down on her shoulders. She couldn't shake the feeling that the forest, the dark figures, were still there, watching her from the shadows. It was just a dream, she told herself, trying to push the terror away. But the next morning, she discovered something strange. As she walked to the bathroom to splash some water on her face, she glanced at her reflection in the mirror. Her eyes were bloodshot, the skin under them bruised with dark circles. But that wasn't what caught her attention. It was the faint, jagged scratch marks along her neck, marks that hadn't been there when she went to sleep. She froze, her fingers brushing against the red welts. How had those gotten there? She hadn't been awake long enough to hurt herself in her sleep, and the marks were too deep to have come from just a restless night. There was no explanation, but as she stared at them, she felt a cold chill creep down her spine. She thought back to the dream, to the forest, to the whispering voices. Could it have been real? But it didn't stop there. The nightmares grew worse, more vivid, more terrifying with each passing night. The creatures in the dreams, shadowy, grotesque beings with glowing eyes and twisted limbs, became more distinct, their forms clearer. They would chase her, taunting her, always just a step behind. And when she awoke, she was often out of breath, drenched in sweat, her pulse racing. And then, one morning, she noticed something she couldn't explain. As she was walking down the street to work, she heard the familiar sound of footsteps behind her, slow and deliberate, following her every move. Sarah quickly turned, expecting to see someone, but the street was empty. It was early in the morning, and the city was still quiet. No one was around. Yet the footsteps continued. Her heart began to race. She picked up the pace, her mind racing with fear. Every time she glanced over her shoulder, she saw nothing but the empty sidewalk behind her. But the sound of someone following her was undeniable. She broke into a run, her legs burning as she sprinted down the street, glancing frantically over her shoulder. There was no one at all. But the sound of the footsteps grew louder, closer, as if the unknown figure was right behind her. "Stop it! Stop it!" she gasped to herself, willing the hallucination to end. But it didn't. Her breath came in short gasps, and just as she rounded the corner, the footsteps stopped. Everything went quiet, eerily so. Sarah slowed to a stop, panting, her pulse still thudding in her ears. She turned around, expecting to find nothing but emptiness. But as she did, she saw something that made her blood run cold. There, standing in the middle of the street, was a figure. It was tall and thin, its body outlined in a shadow so deep it seemed to suck the light from the surroundings. Its face was featureless, smooth, except for two glowing eyes that burned a fiery red. It didn't move. It didn't need to. Sarah could feel its presence, suffocating her. A coldness that made her want to curl up and disappear. "Who are you?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it tilted its head slowly, as though considering her. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, it disappeared, melting into the shadows of the alley beside her. Sarah stood frozen, her legs shaking beneath her. The city had resumed its normal hustle and bustle, people walking past her without a second glance. No one seemed to notice what she had seen, what had followed her. It was as if it had never happened. But Sarah knew the truth. The nightmare had followed her into the waking world. As she walked the rest of the way to work, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The world around her felt different, darker, colder, as if the lines between her dreams and reality were beginning to blur. The figures from her nightmares weren't just figments of her imagination anymore. They were real, and they were coming for her. That night, she locked every door and window in her apartment, pulling the curtains tightly shut, not caring about the stifling heat. She was terrified to sleep, knowing what awaited her in the dark. But exhaustion overtook her, and as the clock ticked past midnight, she finally drifted off, her eyes heavy. She woke with a start, gasping for air. The room was suffocatingly silent, and for a moment, she wondered if everything had been a dream. But as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she saw it. A shadow moved across the wall, and then the whispering began. The whispers that echoed through Sarah's room were faint at first, like a soft breeze pushing against the window, but they soon grew louder, curling around her like a choking fog. She pulled the blanket over her head, hoping to block out the sound, but it followed her, relentless and sinister. The voices were no longer just whispers. They were words now, words that seemed to come from everywhere, coming at her from all directions. "Sarah, we're watching. We're here." Her heart raced as she turned toward the corner of the room, her eyes straining against the darkness. At first, she saw nothing, just the dim shapes of her furniture, the outline of her bedroom door, and the flickering shadows on the walls. But as she blinked, they shifted. The shadows in the corner of the room moved. They seemed to stretch and writhe like living things, crawling toward her with an unnatural slowness. At first, it was just a blur, an indistinct mass, but then the shapes became more defined. They were figures, humanoid in shape, but twisted and grotesque, their bodies contorted in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Some of them had elongated limbs, others had faces that melted into black voids, but they all had the same glowing eyes. Red, burning eyes. Her breath caught in her throat. She couldn't move. She wanted to scream, but the words stuck in her throat. All she could do was stare in horror as the shadows slithered toward her bed, their movements growing faster, more frenzied. She tried to bolt upright, to get out of bed, but her body felt like it was made of stone. The weight of the blankets felt like chains, holding her down, suffocating her. The figures closed in on her, their forms becoming more distinct with every passing second. They were getting closer. One of them, the tallest one, reached out a hand, its long, clawed fingers coming toward her face. Its voice, now unmistakably deep and cold, whispered her name. "Sarah, your soul is ours." The instant it touched her skin, she felt a sharp, icy coldness spread through her body, freezing her in place. A scream clawed at her throat, but it was muffled, smothered by an invisible force. And then, in the blink of an eye, the room went dark. She shot upright in bed, gasping for air. Her chest heaved, her body slick with sweat, and the sheets tangled around her limbs. Her heart was pounding in her ears, and she could feel the weight of the nightmare still pressing down on her. She was awake, but it didn't feel like it. The room was empty. Her apartment was silent. It had all been a dream. But then she noticed it, the coldness, the suffocating chill that filled the air, as if winter had come early. But it wasn't the kind of cold she was used to. It was unnatural, sharp, and biting. The shadows, they were still there. She whipped her head toward the corner of the room where the figures had appeared in her nightmare. There, in the faint glow of the moonlight streaming through the blinds, the shadows had taken form again. Not fully, but enough to be unmistakable. They were watching her. Her breath hitched in her chest as the shadows seemed to shift, to move, as though they were alive, following her every movement. She backed away slowly, her mind racing, trying to make sense of the situation. Was she still dreaming? Was this real? No, this was real. With trembling hands, she reached for her phone, wanting to call for help, but as soon as her fingers brushed against the screen, the phone went dead. The screen remained black. She checked the battery, full charge, but still it refused to turn on. The shadows stirred again, this time crawling toward her, like hungry beasts drawn to the scent of prey. Without thinking, Sarah scrambled out of bed, her legs weak, barely holding her up as she ran for the door. But as she tried to open it, the handle wouldn't budge. She yanked at it, her fingers gripping the cold metal, but it was as if the door had become one with the wall. She was trapped. The whispers were louder now, not just voices, but laughter. Cold, mocking laughter that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. "Sarah, we know you. We know everything about you. You can't escape." Terror surged through her, and in a panic, she turned back to the room. She had to get out. She had to escape. But the shadows were closing in, their forms now more solid, their eyes burning brighter. And then, from the corner of her eye, she saw something she hadn't noticed before. In the far corner of the room, just beside the window, was a figure. A figure standing motionless in the dark, watching her. It was unlike the others. Its form was solid, human, but its face was a blur, a vague shape of something she couldn't quite make out. It was tall, its presence undeniable, and it felt different. A chill ran down her spine as she stared at it. She wanted to scream, but the words died in her throat. The figure moved, slowly at first, then faster, its long legs carrying it toward her with an unsettling grace. And then it spoke. "Sarah, it's not over. It's only just begun." The voice was low, almost mechanical, but there was something hauntingly familiar about it. It was as if it had been part of her dreams, part of something bigger, something she could never escape. With the figure getting closer, Sarah felt a surge of terror unlike anything she had ever experienced. The shadows closed in, their cold touch reaching out to her, and she had only one thought in her mind. She had to run. But before she could move, the figure was upon her, its face now fully revealed. It was her face, her own face, twisted and distorted beyond recognition, staring back at her with those glowing red eyes. And then, everything went black. When Sarah awoke, she wasn't sure if she was still trapped in the nightmare. The coldness, the shadows, and the figure with her own face. Everything from her dream had bled into her waking world. But the moment she opened her eyes, she was alone again, lying in her bed, bathed in pale morning light. The sun was rising, casting a weak glow through the window, but the warmth it brought didn't comfort her. It felt hollow, as if the world was just slightly off, and everything was happening in a cruel mockery of normalcy. She sat up, her body trembling. Was she going insane? Had she truly seen the figure in the corner of the room? Or was it just another fragment of the nightmare? She glanced around her room, heart still racing. Everything was just as it should be. The same mismatched furniture, the cluttered desk, the piles of clothes she had thrown around the night before. But her gaze froze when she saw something that shouldn't have been there. Her bedroom door, which she had tried to open last night only to find it locked, was now ajar. It had been locked. Her heart skipped a beat. She knew, without a doubt, that she had tried to leave. She had pulled on the door handle with all her strength, but it hadn't moved. So why was it open now? Numb with fear, she swung her legs over the side of the bed, her feet hitting the cold floor. She slowly approached the door, her mind racing with possibilities. Could someone have entered while she was asleep? Had it all been a nightmare? But she knew the answer. Deep down, she knew the truth. The shadows from her dreams were real. As she stepped into the hallway, her breath caught in her throat. The house was eerily quiet. It was too quiet. There were no sounds of life, no familiar hum of her neighbors' televisions or the faint clink of dishes in the kitchen. The silence pressed in on her like a weight. She moved cautiously, her footsteps barely making a sound as she walked through the narrow hallway. The walls seemed to close in around her, the shadows lingering in the corners, stretching like they were alive. It was then that she heard it, the faint sound of scratching. It was soft, rhythmic, like claws scraping against wood, and it was coming from behind her. She froze, her heart thudding in her chest, every instinct screaming at her to turn around. But when she did, there was nothing there. The scratching continued, a maddening sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Sarah's mind spun, her fear making it impossible to focus. She had to get out. She had to escape. But just as she started to move, she heard something else. Footsteps. Heavy, slow, deliberate footsteps, echoing from the darkness at the end of the hallway. It was the same figure from her dreams. She was certain of it. It was coming for her. With panic rising in her throat, Sarah turned and bolted down the stairs, her heart pounding in her ears. The footsteps followed, relentless and steady, growing louder with each passing second. The house seemed to stretch out before her, its long corridors and dark rooms now full of malevolent energy. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in, trapping her within their reach. She stumbled into the living room and grabbed her phone off the table, desperate to call for help. But when she tried to unlock it, the screen flickered and went black. Her phone was dead, her only connection to the outside world useless. She cursed under her breath, throwing the phone aside in frustration. But as she did, her eyes caught a movement from the corner of the room. A shadow. It was fleeting, just a glimpse of something moving too fast for her to identify, but it was enough to send a jolt of terror through her. She turned toward it, but the living room was empty, save for the furniture and the faint light coming in through the windows. Her breath came in short gasps. She had to leave. She had to escape the house before whatever haunted her had a chance to catch up. But as she reached the front door, her hand on the knob, she hesitated. The door wouldn't open. It was locked. She spun around, looking for something, anything that could help. But the footsteps were getting closer. Slow, deliberate, and impossibly close. Sarah. The voice was faint, distorted, but unmistakable. It was coming from behind her. She whipped around, her eyes searching frantically for the source of the voice. But there was nothing there. Then, with a terrifying suddenness, the door behind her creaked open, revealing the dark, empty street outside. She didn't hesitate this time. With one final glance toward the hallway, she dashed out the door and into the night. The chill of the evening air hit her like a slap, but it was a relief compared to the suffocating feeling inside the house. She ran down the street, the familiar neighborhood streets stretching out before her. The houses were quiet, dark, the windows like lifeless eyes staring back at her. But then, she heard it again. The footsteps, louder now, closer. Her heart raced as she looked over her shoulder, half expecting to see the shadowy figure from her nightmares closing in. But there was nothing there, no one in sight. It was only when she reached the end of the block that she saw it, the figure standing motionless in the distance. It was far enough away that she couldn't make out the details, but she could see the outline clearly. It was tall. Its shape was indistinct, but its presence was undeniable. The figure stood in front of a house that looked strangely familiar. Her heart sank. It was her childhood home, the house she had left years ago, the house she had tried to forget. But it wasn't empty anymore. The lights inside flickered on, one by one, as if beckoning her inside. And the figure, her own twisted reflection, began to move. Sarah couldn't tear her eyes away from the house. Every inch of her screamed at her to run, to flee from whatever terrible force was drawing her closer to it. But her feet felt like they were glued to the cold concrete. The figure, her twisted reflection, stood motionless in front of her childhood home, its presence hanging in the air like a heavy fog. It wasn't moving, but it was watching her, waiting. She had left that house years ago, and for good reason. The memories of her childhood, they were fragmented, like pages torn from a book, their edges frayed with time and fear. But the house had always haunted her, even when she had tried to bury it all deep inside her. And now, as if fate itself had decided to unearth those buried horrors, it was calling her back. The lights inside the house flickered again, one by one, as though something or someone was playing with them. The glow from the windows seemed unnatural, too bright, too harsh, like the eyes of a predator staring out from the dark. The figure, still distant, finally took a step forward. A jolt of terror shot through Sarah, and her feet moved before her mind could even catch up. She turned and bolted down the street, her breath coming in desperate gasps as her heart thundered in her chest. She couldn't go back there. Not now. Not after all these years. But as she sprinted down the empty road, she felt something cold brush against her neck, like a whisper of icy fingers. She whipped around, heart pounding, expecting to see something behind her. Someone. But there was nothing. Only the empty, silent streets. Her breath came out in shallow bursts as she turned the corner, her eyes darting nervously as she scanned the empty road. She wasn't sure what terrified her more, the thought of the figure following her, or the growing sense that she had never really escaped. She had tried. She had left. But now the past was catching up with her, one step at a time. The footsteps started again. She froze. They were faint at first, as if someone was walking behind her in the distance. But with each step, they grew louder, closer, steady, relentless. It wasn't just her imagination. The footsteps were real, and they were following her. Sarah's skin crawled as she picked up her pace, her legs aching as they carried her down the road. She didn't dare look back. Not yet. She couldn't. But the sound of the footsteps echoed in her ears, each step mirroring her own, like a shadow, always just a second behind. She needed to get to safety. She needed to find somewhere, anywhere, where she could hide, somewhere far from whatever was chasing her. And then, as if to confirm her worst fears, she saw it, the figure again. But this time it was much closer. It was standing in the middle of the street, no more than a few yards away from her. It was still far enough that she couldn't see its face clearly, but the shape of it was unmistakable. Tall, thin, with an unnatural stillness to its movements, as if it were waiting for her to make the first move. A chill crept up her spine as she took a hesitant step backward, the air around her growing colder with each passing second. The figure didn't move, but it didn't have to. Its presence was enough to paralyze her with fear. The footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening. And then, in the distance, she heard something else. A voice. It was faint at first, a whisper carried by the wind, but it was unmistakable. Her name, Sarah. The voice was low, guttural, distorted, but it carried a weight of familiarity. It was a voice she knew, one that had been lost to her for years. It was the voice of her mother. Sarah, come home. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The world around her seemed to tilt, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. She wanted to scream, but her voice was trapped inside her throat. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. Her mother had died years ago, after a long battle with illness. Sarah had been a teenager at the time. She had never truly accepted her mother's death, but she had done her best to move on. She had left that house, left her past, and buried the pain. But now it was all coming back. The figure in front of her slowly raised its arm, pointing toward the house, the one place she had sworn never to return to. The house that held so many memories, both beautiful and terrifying. Come home, Sarah, the voice whispered again, this time louder, more insistent. Come home before it's too late, before it's too late. Her pulse hammered in her ears as she tried to gather her thoughts. The words made no sense. She couldn't go back. She couldn't face whatever waited for her there. Not after all this time. Not after the years of trying to forget. But the voice, her mother's voice, kept calling to her, pulling at something deep inside her. It was a plea, a command, a warning. Sarah, the figure began to move, its movements slow and deliberate, its form becoming clearer as it advanced toward her. Her heart pounded in her chest as she turned and ran, her feet pounding the pavement as she sprinted away from the figure, away from the house, away from everything that was now chasing her. The footsteps returned, faster this time, closer, relentless. No matter how fast she ran, the figure was always behind her, its presence looming over her like a dark cloud. She reached a park at the edge of the neighborhood, gasping for breath as she slowed to a stop. Her legs were weak, trembling beneath her, but she couldn't stop. Not now. As she leaned against a tree, trying to steady her breath, she heard the voice again. This time, it wasn't just her mother's voice. It was her father's, and her brother's. Come home, Sarah, they all said in unison. Come home. We've been waiting for you. Sarah's stomach churned as her blood ran cold. The nightmares, everything she had been trying to escape, had all led her here. And now, there was no turning back. Sarah's legs shook violently, the tremors rippling up from her feet to her chest as she leaned against the tree in the park. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps, and the sounds of her heart pounding in her ears drowned out all else. The voices, the ones she had so desperately tried to push away, kept repeating her name, louder this time, echoing through the air like a haunting chorus. Sarah, come home. Each whisper seemed to vibrate through her body, pulling her deeper into the nightmare she had tried to outrun for years. Her hands clenched into fists as she squeezed her eyes shut, desperately willing herself to wake up, to escape from the madness that had begun to bleed into her reality. But no matter how hard she tried, there was no escape. The whispers faded, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to linger in the air, heavy with dread. Slowly, cautiously, Sarah opened her eyes and surveyed her surroundings. The park, once a place of comfort and refuge from the chaos of the world, now felt wrong, distorted, as though she had stepped into a world that was no longer hers. The sky had darkened without her noticing, the sun swallowed by thick, low-hanging clouds. The trees, usually lush and vibrant, seemed twisted, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. A cold wind blew through the empty streets, carrying with it a faint scent of decay, like something long forgotten. She glanced back at the street she had just fled from, the one that led back to her childhood home. The house, the cursed place, was still there, standing in the distance like a silent sentinel. The figure from before, the one that had haunted her every step, was gone, but she could feel its presence in the air, watching her, waiting for her to return. Her stomach churned with a mixture of dread and confusion. What was happening to her? How could everything she thought she had left behind come back to haunt her so vividly? The nightmares had never been this real, this alive. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt so trapped, so utterly powerless. A sound broke the silence, the distant rustle of leaves. She turned her head, her senses on high alert. For a moment, she thought it was just the wind until she saw it. A shadow. At first, it was just a movement in the corner of her eye, fleeting and elusive. But as she focused, it grew clearer, more defined. A figure, standing at the far end of the park, its silhouette outlined against the darkened sky. Her heart stopped. It was the same figure, the one from her nightmares, the one she had seen standing outside her house. Its presence, though distant, sent a chill creeping down her spine. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching her with an unsettling stillness. Without thinking, Sarah turned and ran, her feet pounding the pavement as she sprinted through the park. Her mind raced in a frenzy, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was it the nightmares? Or was it real? Was she losing her grip on reality? Or had something more sinister entered her life? Something that wanted her back? The shadows seemed to stretch out in front of her as she ran, the air growing heavier with each step. She couldn't outrun the fear no matter how fast she ran. Her mind was racing in a million directions, each thought louder than the last. Was she going insane? Was this all just a product of her broken psyche? But deep down, she knew the answer. This wasn't her mind playing tricks on her. This was real. The nightmares, the figures, the voices, they were all real. And they were coming for her. She turned another corner, hoping to put more distance between herself and the park. But her surroundings seemed to shift with each step. The streets no longer looked familiar. The houses were different, their structures warped and twisted, their windows dark like hollow eyes staring back at her. Everything was changing. Everything was wrong. She slowed to a stop, panting heavily, trying to steady her racing thoughts. The figure was gone for now, but she could still feel its presence, lurking just out of sight. She needed to think, to find a way out of this nightmare before it consumed her completely. That's when she heard it. A faint sound, like footsteps approaching from behind. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. The street was empty, the darkness pressing in from all sides. But the sound was still there, soft, steady, like someone walking toward her in the silence of the night. Her breath hitched in her chest, and she took a step back. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until she could hear them clearly. It was unmistakable. Someone or something was walking toward her, step by slow step. She turned again and bolted down the street, the cold wind biting at her skin as she ran. She didn't know where she was going, didn't care. She just had to get away. But the footsteps didn't stop. They followed her, closing in with every passing second, like a predator stalking its prey. Her chest tightened, and panic began to claw at her insides. She reached the end of the street and found herself standing in front of a large, iron gate. The gate that led to the cemetery. A sickening realization washed over her as she stared at the gate. The footsteps had stopped, but the whispers had started again. "Sarah?" The voice was faint, but it was unmistakable. Her mother's voice, her father's, her brother's. They were calling her back. The air around her grew colder, and she could feel something stirring behind her. She didn't dare look. Not yet, but she could feel its presence, close, too close. "Come home, Sarah." Her heart raced as she grabbed the iron bars of the gate, her fingers trembling. She didn't know what was waiting for her on the other side, but she had to find out. She had to face whatever it was before it consumed her. With one last, desperate glance over her shoulder, she pushed the gate open and stepped into the darkness. And then, everything went black. Sarah's world dissolved into darkness the moment she stepped through the iron gate. Her surroundings seemed to blur, the familiar sounds of the world replaced by an eerie silence. The air grew thick, oppressive, like something ancient and malevolent was watching her, waiting for her to make a wrong move. Her pulse hammered in her ears, and her breathing came out in shallow gasps. She didn't know what to expect in the cemetery, but whatever it was, she could feel it pressing in on her, the walls closing in. Every step she took seemed to draw her deeper into the nightmare. She stumbled forward, her feet sinking slightly into the soft earth beneath her, the gravel crunching beneath her boots. The faint light from the streetlights at the edge of the cemetery cast long shadows across the gravestones, stretching and contorting into grotesque shapes that seemed to move when she wasn't looking directly at them. A chill ran through her, and she shivered, hugging her arms tightly against her chest. The temperature had dropped drastically, and the night seemed colder than it had ever been. She looked around, but the shadows seemed to shift, making it impossible to see anything clearly. The tombstones around her were old, their inscriptions worn away by time, the names of the deceased long forgotten. Each grave seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, a dark force that lingered in the air. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that the very earth beneath her feet was alive with something that didn't want her here. But she had no choice. She had come this far, and she had to keep going. With every step, the whispers grew louder. Her mother's voice, her father's, her brother's, each one blending into the others until it became a maddening cacophony of voices calling out to her, pleading with her. "Sarah, come back." The wind picked up, swirling around her, carrying the voices with it. The sound of her name echoed through the cemetery, louder now, until it felt like it was coming from everywhere at once. It was all she could hear, all she could focus on. "Please, Sarah." Her head spun, and for a moment, she felt like she was losing herself in the voices, in the shadows, in the very darkness that had swallowed her whole. But then she remembered. She remembered why she had come here. The nightmares, the figures, the creeping sense that everything was falling apart. She had to find out the truth. She had to know what was happening to her, to understand why this nightmare, this living nightmare, was spilling into her waking world. Sarah pushed forward, her feet crunching on the gravel as she moved deeper into the cemetery. The graves seemed to stretch out before her, endless rows of stone markers, each one hiding a secret, a story long forgotten. But then, ahead of her, she saw it, a figure standing alone in the distance. It was tall, its outline barely visible in the dim light, and as her eyes locked onto it, a jolt of terror shot through her veins. The figure was not human. The shape was wrong, distorted, its limbs too long, its face hidden in shadow. But there was something about it, something unmistakable. the same presence she had felt in her nightmares, the same feeling that had gripped her when she saw the figure standing outside her house. This time, though, the figure was moving. Slowly, it took a step toward her, its movements unnatural, like it was gliding over the ground rather than walking. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The figure's eyes, two dark, hollow sockets, locked onto hers, and in that moment, everything went still. The wind stopped, the voices faded, and all that was left was the figure, staring at her with an intensity that made her blood run cold. Her legs refused to move. She couldn't tear her eyes away, even though every instinct in her screamed to run. The figure seemed to be waiting, as if daring her to approach. But Sarah knew better. She knew that if she stepped forward, if she gave in to the fear that was gnawing at her from the inside, she would be lost. Lost to whatever darkness had taken hold of this place, of her. And yet, despite the terror, despite the overwhelming urge to flee, Sarah's feet moved on their own, drawn toward the figure as if it had a power over her, pulling her closer with every step. The closer she got, the more the world around her seemed to shift. The shadows deepened, and the air grew thicker, heavier, until it felt like she was walking through a dream, a nightmare that refused to let go. The figure stopped, just as she reached its side. Sarah stared up at it, her heart hammering in her chest, her mind screaming for answers, for some way to understand what was happening. And then, without warning, the figure's hand reached out and grabbed her wrist. The contact was cold, so cold that it burned. Felt like ice, like death itself was gripping her. She tried to pull away, but the figure's grip tightened, its fingers digging into her skin. Sarah. The voice came from the figure, low and guttural, but unmistakable. It was her mother's voice, distorted and twisted by something far darker than she could comprehend. "Sarah, you should have never come back." The words sent a shock of ice through her veins, and for a moment, she thought she might faint. Her body shook violently, but the figure held her firm, unyielding. She could feel its presence in her bones, in the very core of her being. This wasn't just a figure. This was something ancient, something that had been waiting for her. And as the figure leaned closer, its breath cold and rancid on her skin, Sarah's mind flashed back to the memories she had buried deep inside. The memories of her childhood, of her family, of the terrible events that had happened in this very cemetery years ago. The truth was out there, and the figure was part of it. Part of the reason her nightmares were now leaking into her reality. "You're not alone, Sarah," the figure whispered, its voice like 1,000 whispers all at once. "We've always been here." Suddenly, the world around her seemed to shift, the ground beneath her feet giving way. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. The figure's grip tightened, and she felt herself being pulled into the earth. The last thing she heard before everything went black was the sound of her own voice calling out, screaming into the void, "Help!" Sarah's breath was ragged, and her heart thudded painfully against her chest as she tried to gather her senses. Darkness engulfed her, but she couldn't tell if her eyes were closed or if she was lost in a void. She felt weightless, suspended, as if the very air around her had turned to liquid. Her body shivered, a cold sweat beading on her forehead. The icy grip of the figure still lingered on her wrist, like a burn that wouldn't fade. She tried to pull away, but the sensation was as real as the ground beneath her. Panic crept in, her breath quickening. She felt her body being pulled deeper into the earth, and she screamed, but no sound came out. The smell of decay and damp earth filled her nose, thick and suffocating. Something heavy pressed down on her chest, making it difficult to breathe. She couldn't move. She couldn't escape. "Sarah?" The voice echoed again, But it was not the figure's voice this time. It was softer, more familiar. Her mother's voice, calling her from the depths of her mind. "Sarah." Her eyes snapped open, and she gasped for air, her chest heaving with the effort. She was no longer in the cemetery. Instead, she found herself in a small, dimly lit room. The air was stale, the walls closing in on her as if the room were shrinking. Her hands trembled as she pushed herself up from the floor, her body feeling heavy, weighed down by an unseen force. The room was barely furnished. An old wooden chair, a cracked mirror, and a small wooden table covered in dust. There was no door, no window, just the suffocating silence that surrounded her. Her mind raced. Had she been brought here by the figure? Was this part of the nightmare? She couldn't tell. All she knew was that she had to get out. She couldn't stay in this place. "Sarah, you have to listen." The voice called out again, but this time it wasn't just in her head. It was coming from the other side of the room. She turned slowly, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. There, standing in the doorway, was her mother. But something was wrong. Her mother's once warm and comforting face was twisted, contorted into something monstrous. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes glowed with an unnatural, eerie light. Her mouth hung open, but no sound escaped her lips, only an unsettling hiss that made Sarah's skin crawl. "Mom!" Sarah's voice cracked as she spoke, her legs refusing to move. Fear rooted her to the spot. "What's happening? Where am I?" Her mother's lips stretched into a grotesque smile, revealing jagged, sharp teeth that seemed far too large for her mouth. The figure in the cemetery had whispered that they had always been here, but now Sarah understood the true meaning behind the words. These weren't just nightmares. These weren't just figments of her imagination. Something far darker was at play, and it had been waiting for her all along. "I told you." The figure's voice echoed from the shadows behind her mother, low and hollow. "You can never escape." Sarah took a step back, her legs trembling beneath her as the room seemed to close in even more, the walls pressing in from every side. The air was thick, suffocating, and the only sound was the beating of her own heart. Her mother reached out a hand toward her, but as she did, her body began to distort, twisting and writhing in unnatural ways. Her arms stretched too far, her fingers elongating into claws, and Sarah felt a cold chill race up her spine. The smile on her mother's face grew wider, the eyes glowing brighter with every passing second. In a panic, Sarah spun around, looking for an escape, but the room had changed. The door had disappeared, and the walls were now lined with mirrors, each reflecting her own terrified face. Her reflection was distorted too, her eyes bloodshot, her skin pale, her mouth frozen in an expression of horror. The air grew colder. A low growl echoed through the room, a sound that didn't belong in this world. The shadows around her seemed to move, stretching and contorting as if they were alive. Her heart pounded in her chest. She needed to get out. She needed to wake up, but she couldn't. The nightmare was real. It was alive, and she was stuck in it. Suddenly, the floor beneath her feet gave way, and Sarah tumbled into an abyss. The air rushed past her, and for a moment, she thought she was falling into nothingness. The darkness consumed her, and she couldn't tell where her body ended and the void began. Then, without warning, she landed with a thud on cold, hard ground. Her breath escaped her in a sharp gasp, and she rolled to her feet, her heart racing. She was no longer in the room, no longer in the place that had held her captive. Instead, she found herself in a forest, dark, dense, and full of twisted trees that seemed to stretch up into the sky like skeletal hands reaching for the heavens. The wind howled through the trees, sending leaves scattering in all directions. The air was thick with fog, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. Sarah stood frozen for a moment, taking in her surroundings. There was no sign of the room she had been trapped in, no sign of her mother, or the monstrous figure from the cemetery. Just the haunting silence of the forest. But she could feel it, the presence, the cold, malevolent force that had been following her from the very beginning. It was here in this forest, and it was closer than ever. And then, from somewhere in the distance, she heard it. A whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. Sarah? The voice was familiar, but not her mother's this time. It was deep, guttural, like the sound of something ancient and evil, and it sent a shiver down her spine. She turned quickly, her eyes scanning the fog-filled trees, but there was nothing, just the rustling of leaves in the wind. And then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. The figure that emerged from the shadows was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs elongated and twisted. Its face was obscured by a hood made of shadow, but Sarah could feel its eyes on her, cold and malevolent, as if it could see into her soul. Her heart pounded in her chest, the sound deafening in her ears as she took a step back, feeling the wet leaves beneath her feet. The forest around her seemed to close in, the fog thickening, swirling like a living entity. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, carrying with it the stench of decay. Sarah, the voice whispered again, this time louder, closer, as if the very air itself had become alive with malice. You can't run from me. Sarah's blood ran cold as the figure took a step forward, its feet making no sound on the ground. It was as if the earth itself was holding its breath, unwilling to let her escape. She took another step back, her body trembling with fear, but she knew she couldn't run. There was nowhere to go. The forest stretched on forever, an endless maze of trees and shadows. The figure raised a hand, and Sarah felt a sharp pain shoot through her chest, as if invisible fingers were gripping her heart. She gasped, clutching her chest, but the pain only intensified. It was as if the figure was feeding off her fear, using it to grow stronger. Why? She whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. Why are you doing this to me? The figure's head tilted to one side, as if it were studying her. You're the one who opened the door, it said, its voice like gravel scraping against stone. You brought me here, Sarah. You can't escape what you've awakened. The ground beneath her feet seemed to tremble, and Sarah's legs gave out beneath her. She collapsed to her knees, the pain in her chest growing unbearable. The figure loomed over her, its presence suffocating, as if it was pulling her into its dark embrace. But then, as if the world itself was responding to her despair, a brilliant light erupted from the ground. Sarah squinted, shielding her eyes from the blinding glow. The figure recoiled, its form shifting and twisting in agony as the light grew brighter. What is this? The figure hissed, its voice laced with fury. You can't hide behind the light forever. Sarah struggled to her feet, the pain in her chest easing as the light bathed her in warmth. She felt a surge of power, a connection to something greater than herself. The fear that had consumed her for so long began to dissipate, replaced by something new, something stronger. You don't control me, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. I'm done running. I won't let you haunt me anymore. The figure screeched in rage, its form contorting and stretching as it tried to fight against the light. But it was too late. The light swallowed it whole, engulfing the darkness in a brilliant explosion of energy. The forest trembled, the trees groaning as the shadows receded. For a moment there was silence, a peaceful, unnerving silence. Sarah stood there, the light surrounding her like a protective barrier, but she knew it wasn't over yet. She could still feel the presence lingering in the air, like a dark cloud just out of reach. The forest around her began to dissolve, the trees fading away like smoke in the wind. The fog lifted, revealing a wide, open space, a field bathed in the soft glow of moonlight. The stars twinkled overhead, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Sarah could breathe. But she knew the nightmare wasn't truly over. Not yet. She took a step forward, and as she did, the ground beneath her feet began to crack. The cracks spread, forming deep fissures that ran through the field, swallowing the earth like hungry mouths. "Sarah," the voice whispered again, but this time it wasn't the figure. It was the voice from her dreams, the one that had haunted her since the very beginning. "You've made a mistake. There's no escape." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She turned, her breath catching in her throat as she saw a figure standing at the edge of the field. It was familiar, but she couldn't place it at first. It wasn't the figure she had faced in the forest. No, this was something different. A woman, pale skin, dark eyes, and long, flowing hair. She was dressed in tattered clothes, as if she had walked straight out of a forgotten memory. And in her eyes, there was something that sent a chill down Sarah's spine. A deep, unspoken sorrow. "Who are you?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. The woman's lips curved into a sad, knowing smile. "I'm the one who tried to warn you," she said softly. "The one who tried to save you. But you were always meant to awaken what lies beneath. The darkness was always a part of you, Sarah." The ground trembled again, and Sarah's stomach twisted with dread. The voice in her mind, the one that had guided her through the nightmare, now sounded less like a warning and more like a threat. "You can't run," the woman said, her voice fading as the field around them began to warp and shift. The stars disappeared, the moon turned blood red, and the shadows returned, creeping along the ground like a living thing. "You can't escape." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she looked around in panic. The field was disappearing, and the nightmare was consuming her once again. The last thing she saw was the woman's face, twisted in a cruel smile, as the darkness swallowed her whole.